we share the net zero emissions goal for 2050. And actually, the Swiss Federal Office of Energy has just very recently published the Energy Perspectives 2050 Plus that show possible technical pathways towards net zero emissions in Switzerland. And while we're quite sure that the clean energy transition and the net zero goal are technically feasible for Switzerland, the challenge will be to design energy markets, regulations, and policies that enable an efficient and inclusive transition. Because the transition will not only be a technical one, we'll need major private investments and substantial changes in energy consumption. And both these things will require behavioral changes, altered incentives, and possibly also adjustments to governance and policies. So this transformation of the energy system has to be achieved while sustaining a high level of individual well-being and quality of life, and by means that are broadly accepted in society. So that's a challenging task indeed, and it's a global one, which is why it's a task where countries, in our view, can immensely benefit from international exchange on advances in research, but also international best practices for policy design in order to best include behavioral aspects for reaching the net zero emissions by 2050. So I would like to thank very much the IEA for providing a forum for this exchange, and also all speakers and moderators for their input today, and of course, all the participants of this webinar. And I would like to address a very special thank you to EGRD and Birte Holsten-Jorgensen, to whom I'm very happy to hand over the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Anne-Christine, and greetings all from Copenhagen. The experts group on R&D, priority setting and evaluation, EGRD, is an informal expert group that for more than 25 years has advised the IEA Committee on Energy Research and Technology on topics of importance to accelerate the clean energy transition. This urgent need is our mission. This is our why. In practice, what we do is to examine analytical approaches to energy technologies, policies, and R&D, and also to promote dialogue and information exchange on methodologies related to technology assessment, priority setting, and evaluation. So more specifically, we focus on three things. One, R&D priority setting and the linkage to governmental policy objectives. Two, methods and approaches for evaluating the impact and also the benefits from energy relevant R&D activities. And thirdly, exploration of emerging and systemic R&D topics not covered by the IEA technology cooperation programs nor the working parties, such as, for example, human behavior, the circular economy, and blue sky research. And how do we do it? We organize semi-annual expert workshops, or in these COVID-19 times, webinars where we invite practitioners and researchers to exchange and discuss topics of relevance for the energy transition. This webinar takes the discussion and insight on behavioral aspects an important step further and adds to the outcome of previous R&D workshops and webinars, such as energy infrastructure public acceptance, hosted by the Swiss Federal Office of Energy in November 2020, energy communities, hosted by the Austrian government in April 2020, new market design, hosted by Projektträger Jülich in Berlin in October 2018, focusing on testing new regulatory frameworks in a confined living lab setting, and also towards a consumer-driven energy system, understanding human behavior, hosted by my own university in Copenhagen in October 2017. The workshop summaries are publicly available, and I will post the link in the chat in a few moments. But let's get started. I hand over the word to Herbert Kreisberger, one of the founders of EGRD and a strong driving force in setting the agenda for a clean energy transition. So Herbert, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Birte. You always remind me that I'm really getting old because I'm one of the founder 25 years ago. But nevertheless, thanks to COVID and the new format, we have much more participants that we usually have in our workshops. Even so, it's always good to see people and to meet people and to have personal discussions. But we will manage in this new format as well as we've done before. In session one, first of all, thanks to all the speakers to give the background and the role of the EGRD and what we have, what actually our job is. And the most important job is to give some advice to CERT and the governments. So in session one, we focus on the design of policies. How can we drive behavioral change and how can we get public acceptance, or not only public acceptance, but some active involvement? Because when we go to net zero emission, it really needs a lot of ambition from everybody, from the countries, from citizens, and from politicians. And politicians will stay with their ambition if they get some positive feedback from the public. So in session one, we focus on best practice examples, on lessons learned, how to design policies that drive behavioral change. How can we mobilize support for these policies, and what are the success factors behind, and where are the failures, what we should try to avoid. This is the job of our 3 speakers in session one. Each of the speaker is asked to stay within 12 minutes. We will then take 1 question from the chat. And in the end, after the 3 presentations, we will have 10 minutes of discussions. So we start with Toby Park. Toby Park is from the UK. For the ones who do not know, the UK is nowadays an island between Europe and the US. He leads the energy and sustainability work at the Behavioral Insight team. He's overseeing the work on energy conservation, sustainable transport, food, circular economy. So quite interesting and broad topics. And one of his recent work is testing ideas to promote the uptake of electric vehicles, for example. He has an interesting CV and he holds a degree from psychology and engineering. So from both ends of our topic, so to say. So Park, Toby, the floor is yours. Please give us your presentation.
Thank you very much. So just to check, I presume my screen is sharing okay? Yeah, great, thank you. Okay, well, thank you for that introduction. So just to briefly introduce the organization I come from as well, the Behavioral Insights team is quite an unusual organization. We were the world's first government organization dedicated to the application of behavioral science to policy problems. We have actually since spun out of government. We operate as a social purpose consultancy now, albeit one that's still part owned by the UK government. But really, our remit is to apply good behavioral science and good research methods to try and solve social and policy problems. And as you just said, my particular focus is on environment and sustainability issues. So normally my expertise is very much on the practical application of behavioral science, developing policy to explicitly encourage and support pro-environmental behavior change. Today I'm talking about something a little bit different. I'm talking more around what, as a behavioral scientist, I think of the notion of public acceptability.
Just a second, Toby.
Yeah.
We can see the slides.
Oh, you can't? Okay.
No, we see the messages from Pierre.
Let's try this. Better?
Now it's fine.
Okay, sorry about that. So just on screen, a few reports I've recently authored or co-authored. As I was saying, really my day-to-day work is a focus on behavior change, but today I'm going to talk more around public acceptability as a behavioral scientist. So I want to run through three sort of fairly fundamental questions, I suppose. Firstly, why might we want to influence behavior, and what are the implications of that on public acceptability or the level of permission we might want and people's response to different arguments for why we might want to change behavior. Secondly, what do people actually want anyway? Understanding attitudes and preferences is not a straightforward thing, and it's worth thinking about that in a little bit of detail. And then thirdly, what are the implications of those questions for how we think about public acceptance? So firstly, why might we want to influence behavior? Well, I think logically well, I guess this could be answered in a number of ways, but one way would be to divide up the benefactors and beneficiaries of this endeavor. So we could perhaps say that we want to influence people's behavior for their own benefit because it brings benefits to them. So for example, we might want to discourage the consumption of unhealthy food. We might want to have age restrictions on tattoos or gambling and so on. Secondly, we might want to influence behavior because it benefits us, i.e. selling more product, eliciting votes, and so on. Thirdly, because it benefits someone else or society at large. So for instance, trying to discourage harmful behaviors like fraud and corruption, or encourage positive behaviors that help other people, like encouraging volunteering or donating blood and so on, or indeed many green behaviors would fit into that category. Or fourthly, maybe there'll be some combination of those things. So for example, we might want to encourage social distancing during COVID, both for the benefit of the target audience who we're encouraging to distance themselves, but also for the benefit of other people who they would otherwise put at risk. So clearly there are various legitimate reasons why a government or some other actor may wish to influence behavior. I think for now we can ignore the second one because I'm not interested in talking about marketing or selling products today and coming more from a sort of policy background. And I think we can focus really on an important distinction I want to make between the first and the third of these rationales. So the first is clearly inherently paternalistic. That is to say, it is an effort to restrict someone's freedom of choice or to encourage a particular behavior for their own benefit. So it's based on this understanding that people don't always know or don't always do what's in their best interests. And there is lots of evidence to show that this is true. So just to give a couple of examples, we tend to be very present biased in our decision making. That is to say, we focus very much on the immediate benefits and costs of the behavior and ignore to some extent or discount the long-term impacts, which is partly why we tend to engage in risky behaviors, things like smoking, unsafe sex, and so on, where there might be an immediate gratification, but a long-term cost. And actually people will readily admit that that's not in their interest. And so, you know, there is potentially a fair rationale for intervening for people's own benefits. But still, there's clearly valid criticism here. You know, it could be construed as nanny statism. It's somewhat infantilizing or patronizing to assume that people don't know what's in their best interests. And of course, it's very difficult sort of logistically really to understand truly what is best for other people. But that's very distinct from the second category, which is not paternalistic. It's really about protecting the vulnerable or the whole of society or certain individuals from harm of others. So it's quite hard to argue that we have the right to commit harm to other people or to society, and likewise hard to argue that others have the right to harm us. And so most environmental behavior change is justified on this basis. In other words, it's pro-social rather than pro-self. So it's an important distinction, and I think one which actually is sometimes overlooked in public debate. So if you think back to something like a smoking ban in public places, which of course has been introduced in many countries over the last few decades, often that would receive criticism for being paternalistic, being nanny state, and so on. But actually it doesn't need to be justified on the grounds of benefiting the people who are being discouraged from smoking. It would equally be justified on the grounds of stopping them from harming others by producing smoke in public spaces where it would harm other people who have a right to not be harmed. So just to sort of build on that dichotomy a bit further, on the one hand, we might have a paternalistic policy restricting our choice for our own benefit. So for instance, putting a tax on sugary drinks. That is philosophically certainly open to debate. It certainly brings benefit to people, but it is potentially considered infantilizing or presumptuous. And yet, interestingly, support is often quite high because ultimately it does benefit the target audience. And sometimes we recognize that we want a nudge to help us act in our own best interests. In contrast, we might have a non-paternalistic policy, for example, restricting our choice to stop us harming others or committing environmental harm. Philosophically, I think that is more clear-cut and defensible. No one has the right to harm other people or society. And yet, weirdly, support is often a bit lower. And yet, it depends, clearly. If it restricts our freedom to cause harm, then it tends to receive less public support. If it restricts others' freedom to harm us, then perhaps not surprisingly, it receives more support. So there is a clear difference between something like a policy to discourage fly tipping or the dumping of waste, which frankly most people thankfully do not participate in, and therefore most people, when they consider this policy, will consider themselves as benefiting from it because it's stopping other people from committing harm. Whereas a policy which might be logically very similar, such as a policy to discourage frequent flying, that tends to receive less support because, of course, many of us now are on the receiving end of that policy, as it were, because we are the ones whose freedoms to cause harm are now being curtailed. So we're rather good at rationalizing our support for policies in sort of convoluted ways, but actually a lot of it will come down to self-interest, whether we are the ones who are having our freedoms restricted or whether we are the ones benefiting from other people having their freedoms restricted. Okay, so what? Well, clearly framing matters. So many policies can be justified on multiple grounds. So for instance, a policy to improve air quality might be justified on health grounds, environmental grounds, economic grounds, and so on. And just to briefly give one of many possible examples of how framing really matters, this study shows that between Republicans and Democrats in the US, reasons for supporting renewable energy differ significantly, whether that's based on environmental concern, economic concern, job security, national security, and so on. So clearly, there are many messages, many justifications for policy that can be leveraged, and support will be very different for each. Okay, time is running on, so I'll briefly move on to the second question, which is, what do we actually want anyway? So here's a fun experiment. If you offer people a choice of coffee, small, medium, and large, most people will go for the medium. And if you ask them why, they will tend to say, well, the small's a bit too small, the big's a bit too big, the medium is the right size for me. But if you do this, you take away the small and you add a larger option and you offer people the new choice set, they tend to go for the new medium. And again, they say, well, the small's too small, the big's too big, the medium is right. But of course, the new medium was the old big. So we're very good at sort of retrospectively coming up with a rational explanation of our behavior, but actually our choices and our preferences are deeply influenced by the context, the way that things are presented and framed to us, things that are available, and so on. So in other words, our preferences are very complex and they're far from sort of sovereign to the individual. We can actually argue that they're more of a product of the context of our economic and social situation, of the material world around us, media influences, and so on, than they are an endogenous or an innate or an immutable characteristic of the individual. They're also not at all consistent. So we have short-term preferences, which often conflict with our long-term preferences. We also have what we call first-order preferences, or those immediate wants, which may be in contrast to second-order preferences, or our want-to-wants. Think about the person that wants to gamble when they walk past the betting shop, but actually wants to not want to gamble because they recognize it's damaging to their own well-being. So there's conflicts there in people's preferences. And these things are further skewed by cognitive biases, like I mentioned, future discounting or present bias earlier, and various other factors. And it's also very hard to actually measure people's preferences. So looking at people's revealed preferences, in other words, what they do, is often a poor measure for their true wants and desires in life. Self-reported preferences, so asking people what they say they want, can be a better measure, but only if it's asked well, and only if you give people the opportunity to be well informed about the consequences and have the time to be thoughtful about their responses. Just to give one example of how preferences and attitudes can shift so dramatically, this is the level of support and opposition to a congestion charge in London. Orange bar is support, blue bar is opposition, immediately before and then after it was introduced. So generally people were kind of a bit so-so about it, somewhat opposing of it before, but as soon as it was introduced, the support went right up, because of course only at that point do people suddenly realize the benefits of it, they live the benefits of it, whereas previously all they can envisage is the privileges they will lose out on because they haven't yet familiarized themselves with the benefits it will bring. So public support can clearly change. Okay, final slide just to wrap up. So just to give a list of sort of so what's and what I think this means for how we think about public acceptability. Framing matters, I've already covered that in the previous point. Second, behavior change can often come first. So we shouldn't be too fixated on whether current attitudes permit, as it were, intervention, obviously within reason. I'm not suggesting we ignore public sentiment and attitudes, far from it, but legitimate changes to the context or to behavior through policy, intervention, etc., will often lead to new preferences and attitudes forming after the fact. So that's an important sort of facet of human nature, which we need to understand if we're thinking about public acceptance. Thirdly, we need to help people help themselves. So we see throughout lots of survey data that often people already have these sort of second order preferences to be healthier, to live in a more sustainable society, even though day to day, it's actually hard to live up to those preferences, and they tend to get crowded out by more sort of short-term preferences, you know, driving is convenient, flying is cheap, etc. So we can, I think, as policymakers afford to pay a bit more attention to those aspirations, even though it's not easy to live up to them in the short term, but also help people close that gap between their intentions and their actions. So, you know, think about removing barriers and frictions and so on, increasing choice, incentivizing positively rather than restricting or penalizing. Fourthly, we can maintain liberty. So a nudge is an intervention which explicitly retains people's freedom of choice, and they can be absolutely effective. Obviously, that's not always going to be enough to reach net zero, but things like using defaults so people still have the opportunity to choose otherwise can be really effective. Fifthly, we need to highlight the benefits of policy and the effectiveness of interventions. Research shows that both of those things do boost support for policy. And finally, we of course need to make policy with the public. Citizens' assemblies, public dialogues and so on, they really do work. They create a strong mandate, they bring fresh ideas. And of course, as I said earlier, when you give people the time to reflect deeply, people are more than capable of making these difficult choices about their lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Toby, for your presentation and for keeping the time limits, more or less. I really would invite every participant to post their questions in the chat. It helps the moderator, it supports the report, so it's a good thing if you just send it to all of us or just to the moderator. I've one question, Toby, on checking your website of the Behavioral Insights team. You have offices in many countries, in different continents, so to say. Is it a problem to transfer the insights from one country, let's say from the US or from Japan, to countries in Europe, or can you use make use of the global knowledge you generate in your organization?
It's a good question, and clearly the specific context of people's lives matters a great deal, and so we always need to be sensitive to that when designing policy and intervention. That said, there are definitely some universals of human nature which seem to apply quite fundamentally. So if you think about the importance of, you know, removing hassle and making the right decision or the sustainable decision easier, that is absolutely going to be universal. You think about the importance of social influence and the way in which we are quite deeply susceptible to social norms. That, of course, is universal, but the point is that the specific content of those norms, the way in which they manifest, the nature of what is seen as normal or high status and so on, will be context specific and cultural specific, even though the fundamental way in which humans work tends to be quite universal. So you need to sort of, you know, build on the universal fundamentals that seem to apply throughout humanity, but also be very sensitive to how they will manifest within a given context.
Okay, thank you very much again for your presentation. We now come to April M. Salas. She's from the US. She's Hannover's NH Chief Sustainability Officer and Executive Director of the Reverse Center for Energy and Dartmouth's Dutch School of Business. She has got 2 decades of experience in public and private sector, so on both sides, experience on energy finance and power delivery, on energy reliability and market analysis, and on new technology integration. Just the third is very much discussing about new technology, innovative, novel technologies and how to bring them into the market. So there's a lot of experience. April, I would invite you to give your presentation and to share your insights with us.
Thank you so much and welcome. Good afternoon. Good morning here for those that are in the US. My name is April Salas. As Everett mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of the Reverse Center for Energy at Dartmouth College's Tuck School of Business. Our center's mission is focused on applied learning at the intersection of industry and research. I've been working in this space for nearly 2 decades in energy, including senior roles at the US Department of Energy, spanning both political parties across 2 administrations. Most recently, under the Obama administration, I was the director of the US Quadrennial Energy Review Secretariat, sanctioned by the US Secretary of Energy and the White House's Domestic Policy Council and the Office of Science, Technology, and Policy. So the focus of my presentation this afternoon is around building broad consensus for climate action, with a focus specifically on the variability in policy and observations in markets and climate action behavior. So let's dive in. So I'm assuming everyone has heard the news that the US has successfully navigated a transfer in administration. And as of January 20th, 2021, US has officially recommitted to rejoining the Paris Climate Accords. Oh, hold on. I just want to make sure you can also see my slides okay.
No, April, I'm afraid we can't see your slides. We have a problem here.
Okay, I'll try it again.
We always have a fallback option, so we can do it from the
Okay,
IA.
can you see? Can you confirm you can see now?
No. We can see only parts of your slides.
Okay, just give it 1 second to load. If I move it here, is that better?
No. No. No, it's good.
Okay, great.
Yes, we see the Paris Climate Agreement.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. So I'm assuming everyone has heard the news that we have rejoined and successfully navigated a transfer in administration as of January 20th, 2021. The US withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accords announced in June 2017 and made official last year, November 4th, 2020, as the first nation in the world to withdraw, had an interesting and semi-inverse effect on the clean energy industry in the US. One of the things that I want to talk about too, as we think about lessons learned in policy, and while I can talk more specifically about policies that are driving action, I wanted to stay sort of at the higher level, the meta level for this conversation. It seems to have accelerated the pace of change and the focus across the country, with a host of new actors actually emerging as leaders in this arena. As I'm sure most of you are aware, or if not, just to state up front that it's important to realize in the US, the federal government does not own or operate the majority of the US energy system. It's actually owned and operated by much of the private sector. So what I'm going to say is really going to speak to some of the things that we've observed over the last two federal administrations. Okay, I'll mute the chat because I was looking there too to make sure you could see my slides. So the Trump administration's focus was an America First energy plan, actually focused on increasing domestic energy production and decreasing reliance on imported energy. So environmental regulations relating to clean air, clean water, clean power were overwhelmingly rolled back. Offshore drilling was permitted. The use of federal land for oil production and oil pipelines was also allowed. And concurrently, despite tariffs levied on imported products believed to negatively impact the solar deployment in the US, what we actually saw over the last 4 years was unprecedented growth in the US solar industry. So for the first time What we're seeing here, you can see is US solar industry added jobs at a rate 5 times the national average, according to the Solar Energy Industry Association, which is a trade organization based in the US for the solar energy industry. So one of the things that we've observed in the last handful of years, and for the first time in my nearly 20 years working globally and domestically on energy, is an inconsistency in US federal policy that's actually led to a perception of increased political risk. It's really just something that we've never seen before. Despite a focus on bringing back the coal industry in the previous administration in the US, gas and renewable power helped to decarbonize the US power mix. So as we look, at the energy trends, we want to think about what the data in the US suggests that we can expect. And the top line is that
April, I'm afraid we still stick with slide number 2.
Oh,
so
is that better?
No, not really. We can see only now we see slide number 6.
Okay, I'm so sorry. Now let's see. I don't think there's much you missed here. Just go back quickly. Okay. All right, so you can see slide number 6.
Yes.
Okay, great. So driving the change, as was talked about in the previous presentation, improved economies and costs of renewables. Renewables increasingly representing the least cost marginal power generation resource across most of the markets in the US. Their permitting and construction process significantly shorter than fuel-based alternatives, and the ability to scale to meet growing demand for power market forces also enabling the producer consumer. So we're seeing the emergence of new actors in the renewable energy space, actually down from what used to be centralized at investor-owned utilities and public power marketing agencies down into the individual household level, and a market for that participation where actors who are producing and consuming are being compensated for that market activity. And that will be really related to the rise in virtual net metering and net metering overall, where we're able to compensate for those distributed energy resources. As you can see, in contrast to the last slide, the planned US utility scale electricity generation capacity additions, according to the US Energy and Information Administration, is expected overwhelmingly to be comprised of solar and wind energy resources. Over 60% is what we expect to be projected into new generation capacities into 2021. Conversely, on the right side of the slide, you see planned capacity retirements into 2021, and it's overwhelmingly nuclear, which has traditionally played a base load capacity resource in the United States, as well as a decline in the coal industry. Additionally, we expect a large capacity of utility scale battery storage to more than quadruple. And the rapid growth of renewables, such as wind and solar, is the major driver behind the expansion of battery capacity, because battery storage systems are increasingly being paired with renewable energy. I'll attempt to shift the slide so you can see. So getting down to the brass tacks of what we've seen in this shift and the variability in federal policy, creating uncertainty actually created more certainty in the markets. It was the assurity that we had withdrawn from the Paris Climate Accords. There wouldn't be federal leadership in this space. It actually created a sense of urgency in action by a new set of actors at the state, city, individual, and corporate levels. So we've seen unprecedented increases in state policies igniting the clean energy economy, corporate sustainability and ESG commitments, followed by actual and meaningful implementation of activities. So just a few examples. Progressive state policies are driving those changes. As we see, New York is the 4th most populous state in the US and the 3rd largest economy, now poised to adopt the country's most ambitious climate targets, including 100% carbon-free electricity by 2040 and economy-wide net zero carbon emissions by 2050. This is also in the footsteps of other states in the US, Maine, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, New Mexico, California, and New Jersey, also joining Hawaii, which has had a 100% renewables target in place since 2015. Really progressive actions at the policy level, such as in California, have also encouraged a shift, sort of removing the sort of, decision-making ability by the individual actor. So any new home, for example, built in California after January 1st, 2020 will be required to have rooftop solar. More recently, in September of last year, Governor Newsom also announced phasing out gasoline-powered cars and drastically reducing demand for fossil fuels in California. So in terms of transportation sector decarbonization, we're seeing really progressive policies actually being led by the states. And so this is okay in the sense that, our regulatory environment is a state-based process. The Public Utilities Commission is the one who are reviewing and approving these more comprehensive policies. So having or activities. So having these policies at the state level actually doesn't necessarily mean anything negative, or sort of impacting the lack of leadership or cohesion around the federal policy. So what else is inspiring this change? It's really looking at the corporations who are driving action. And as we've seen this rise in Ready for 100 and science-based targets initiatives, over 280 companies have since declared their own progressive targets for either 100% renewable energy or extreme decarbonization of their operations, their scope 1, 2, or 3 emissions. And we are starting to see a number of companies becoming more progressive and establishing new programs to get deeper into their supply chains in terms of decarbonization and increasing renewable energy. On the science-based targets, over 942 companies have agreed to take science-based action, and over 420 have meaningful targets that are already science-based and approved. We're seeing the new renewable energy landscape. As I mentioned, the numbers on the left are from 2019. We've already seen that increase just in the early days of 2021. The global corporate power purchase agreement volumes is increasing meaningfully. The blue bar represents the Americas, and the gigawatt additions just in 2019 alone show that the lack of federal cohesion around supporting decarbonization or renewable energy didn't slow the industry down. As we see, US corporations have accelerated the pace of change. You can see the dip in 2016 when the Trump administration took office, and subsequently in 2017 when we formally announced our intentions to withdraw. That's where you see the market increase in accelerated action by large energy buyers, which is really a signal of corporations and their role, despite a variety of sort of policy perceptions around policy that would inhibit their growth. It's actually not slowed down that growth at all. If we look at a specific example, and I'll wrap up here pretty soon, but we can take the example of Microsoft, and we're seeing this more increasingly, who are expanding exponentially in terms of power demand, growth in this COVID reality, data centers, high-speed internet, et cetera. More connected individual households as well as communities are placing higher demand on growth for power. We see here the president of Microsoft, their CFO, and the CEO have aligned their intentions, and it's actually policies at the corporate level that are resonating within the C-suite that are helping to drive action. So if we look at Microsoft's specific goals to be carbon negative by 2030, removing historical carbon emissions back by 2050 to the company's founding, and establishing a $1 billion innovation fund for climate, we can also see that this has evolved over the course of the previous two administrations, and now we see these very strong policies that we expect to not only continue to grow, but to expand into additional social programs around environmental energy transition and environmental justice. So really digging down into what this means at the state level, we can see, globally, you can see some of the projects that have been announced in Ireland and the Netherlands, but specifically we see how this impacts state policy and local job creation. So supporting, 20 megawatts of solar in Virginia, 110 megawatts of new wind in Texas, and 175 in Illinois. Technology is, the other unsung hero in the United States, which is actually unlocking those market participants, as I mentioned. New emerging business models and third-party actors are also emerging as a result of this. And I specifically am relating this to net metering, which, as I mentioned at my opening, really enables the producer-consumer to be a market participant. So as we, this is my last slide, as we look to the future and we sort of also summarize the last 4 years within the United States, federal policies have transferred action from the federal space to really defining an opportunity, a clear opportunity for corporations, states, and actually down into the individuals. We can expect broad-based electrification, decarbonization programs to be rolled out government-wide over the next 4 years. We are still analyzing the impacts of COVID-19 on the clean energy economy, which remains uncertain. And we do think that there will be a much stronger emphasis and focus on energy transition and social justice, getting down really into the individual neighborhoods as we think about the transfer of technology and who benefits and who should be included as we look at our policies and sort of our framing for the business model around the power sector. So with that, I will thank you and pause for questions.
Thank you very much, April. We are a little bit late, I have to say, and I would like to ask you if you could maybe answer some of the questions, there are quite many, after our session in the chat, if possible. And we will have a small discussion after all 3 presentations. So thank you very much for your presentation. We are very happy that the US is not only back, but that the US is leading the way to net zero emission globally. You are very, very important, and we are happy to see you again on board of the IA and of the CERT and the EGRD. I'd like to go to the next speaker, Lars Klivers from Denmark. He's the director of the Danish Board of Technology Foundation. He has more than 30 years of experience in parliamentary policy advice. So the parliament may change, the advice stays the same. For his experience in technology assessment and technology foresight, he's very experienced in participation, and he's the initiator of the Worldwide Views Initiative. That's a method for global participation of citizens, and he's facilitating the Citizen Assembly in Denmark at the moment. Lars, please give us your presentation.
Yes, thanks, Herbert. Yes, I call my presentation Inclusive Processes for Increased Behavioral Compliance, but in fact, I'm let's see. What I will take the take from the policy side. Where do we see policy obstacles for climate compatible behavior? I will take 4 examples. When we individualize too much, when we underestimate the need for know-how, when we ignore the power of shared ownership, and when political behavior is too hesitating. And I will say also, how can inclusive processes help in these situations where policy is you could say, a negative context for behavior change. Let's take the first example, individualizing the collective responsive. We have this about eat less red meat, because cows ends up in a lot of methane. And it is quite obvious that this could easily be de-individualized by a climate tax on red meat. And it's also obvious that the revenue could be used to compensate for inequality effects so that poor people still can buy food. We have another thing in buy an e-vehicle. What is a hen? There's a hen and egg problem there. Will people buy an e-vehicle if they do not see a policy for a rollout of a charging infrastructure? So that's a lesson learned we hear. We can't individualize the need for action. We can't ask people to change their behavior if we do not make the regulation or the public investments that would be needed for their for them to actually act on it, or for their action to be effective. We can learn from citizens on this. There are a lot of deliberative mini publics that can identify where policy should step in, which actions it could take, and how it could back up behavioral change. I just want to give 2 examples. Citizen assemblies. I'm leading the facilitation of the Danish one at the moment. It's typically between 50 and 100 plus persons. They are found by lottery among the population. They meet for quite many weekends. It's hard work to be part of a citizen assembly. And they develop a lot of recommendations, assessments, and they decide on them by votes. There's also the consensus conference model, which is a little panel, 12 to 16 persons. They're selected to be very diverse, with the idea that if they can agree on something, then probably everybody could. And they meet 3 large weekends, and they decide by consensus, which means they basically agree on everything they write. So these are just examples of mini publics that could be used to examine policies for what they do to society and what they do to citizens. Another is failing to provide know-how. We know from Danish surveys that they indicate that 2/3 of the population really want to change behavior on climate-related issues, but half of them don't know how to do it and what to do it, and they're confused by all the different information they get. It points in the one direction and the other direction. And it's also interesting to see that I would like to hear about countries that have a very clear policy for empowering citizens by giving them such kind of know-how. I have no examples actually, but I would like to hear if there are some. The feeling of being unempowered to do the right thing will certainly drain motivation. I don't want to do something if I'm not sure that it's the right thing to do. So why don't we teach citizens? And we can even do that in inclusive ways. There's an obvious lack of public investment in that. Large-scale public education programs have, and when I'm talking about public education, I'm not talking about campaigns. I'm talking about getting people into rooms where they talk, they discuss, they learn. Bottom-up networks for social transitional learning, we could support them. That could be local networks and so on. Give them incentives to go together and do something locally. Platforms for achieving independent and validated know-how. I can show one which we are at the Danish Board of Technology Development for the EU at the moment. It's called Act for Eco. By the way, we try to find people who would like to translate it to more countries. You could contact me on that if you want. Green guides have been used. Persons pointed out by municipalities and so on, help people doing the right things. My third example is ignoring the power of shared ownership. You could say what a citizen could reasonably say that if an installation, a deployment of a wind turbine is put up near to their house, they will get all the disadvantages, while that company who put it up will get all of the profit. So that's a very good example of a good reason for having the NIMBY not in my backyard, because they're actually well reasoned. So there's also good examples of a non-NIMBY situation, and they're often characterized by shared ownership. You could say that does that have to do with? It has to do with acceptance, but also behavior. It has to do with. If you're part of the large transition by money, being part of owning it, then you're also being part of something. You're part of the transition as such. So shared ownership is a concrete form of bottom-up inclusion into the transition, which contrasts to large companies or the states coming and just putting up equipment close to your house. So let citizens take part. That's also a point of inclusiveness. Develop policies that allow citizens to be co-designers and co-investors in the climate compliant production systems. There are schemes for large energy for citizen shares of large energy production plants that could be used. Also, policies could be made to make it easier for people to take local initiatives and like collective local investments in energy systems. And here I have a picture from Hvidovre Harbor in northwest of Denmark. There are they are small on the picture, wind turbines, but they're actually huge. And it's that little city that invested in them. They did it through the district heating company in that place. And they love their wind turbines because it's the revenue from it pays for the expanding of the harbor, and it's a fishing society. So they really needed a better harbor. The last thing I would say is a big one. If they don't act, why should I? So citizens are sitting there. They're looking at the policy field, and they can see that not enough is happening. That is not motivating for changing behavior yourself. There are reasons for this. You have people who are afraid of more inequality in the process, people who are afraid of not using the market too much, and these two often block each other's political actions. But it comes up in a login. Much could be done, which are not really done because of this political login. So it's hard to explain to citizens that they should change their behavior when they're witnessing a lack of political action. So how could inclusion work on that? Well, there are methodologies which can look at policy options and evaluate them to give them back up, and you could say give politicians a stronger mandate to act on things where the citizens think they should act. There are different hearing methods that are very good at scrutinizing policies in depth, and methodology like the citizen summons are very well established, and they provide a representative policy evaluation simply by voting, discussing first different policies and voting on them. And here's a picture for that in the city of Kalundborg in Copenhagen. So it's a quite large event. They can be done up to more than 10,000 people if that's needed. My key message is, to make it brief, behavioral change does not live in a vacuum. It also depends on policy change, and especially if it has to embrace more than the holy few. There are a lot of examples of that, but actually it takes deep and wide policy change. And I think there's not enough focus in policy on this aspect, that policies actually also have to be motivating for the populations. So it's the speed of policy actions, establishes the needed infrastructure so that people actually can do what they want to do, use taxes when that's actually the best way to do it. Do not have ideologies going against that, because people want to change and they also want to be pushed to change something, which we heard in an earlier presentation. Dismantling barriers for local citizen initiatives and so on. Make use of public policy processes in policy processes to increase the effectiveness and the legitimacy, to increase the mandate for politicians to move. And these kind of discussions often ends up in a methodological discussion. We shouldn't do that. We have all the needed methods to be inclusive for citizens in the energy and climate policies that should also help them change their behaviors, help the citizens change their behaviors. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Lars, for your presentation. I mean, Denmark is, at least from our perspective, a very successful country when it comes to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and also to a country with very ambitious targets for the next decade. Do you think that one of the key factors for this policy or for this success is that you, more than other countries, involve citizens into this process? Is this one of the key aspects for that?
I think it's part of it. I think there was a lot of discussions in Denmark before the change of the century about environment, and citizens got very involved in that. We have a very lively civil society life. We had a very big public education sector that has been downscaled, which I think is a problem at this moment when we're talking about the new transitions we have to do. But I even though you say that, Herbert, I also think we could be much better at it, much better. So even if you say that Denmark is ahead of things, maybe we are, but yeah, there's a long way to go if you really want to get people involved.
Thank you very much. Again, we have, I guess, 10 minutes left for the final discussion. And thank you very much, April, and all the others for your comments in the chat. We really use them for the report and for the advice we give to certain our countries. And for a final round, I'd like to ask all the speakers, and I would start with April because I have to apologize that I was not able to ask a question before. If a more general question, April, in the US, you have seen a lot of policies, a lot of state action on climate policy. What are, from your perspective, the successful factors? What are successful policies? What can you learn from your state action? How can we design policies that have a real public acceptance?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest factors that we've seen the highest success is inclusion of industry as well as the citizen action. It's been talked about, and I would love to be a part of the next panel as well, to really go deep into the work that we're doing at the most local level, you know, even with the advent of community power legislation, for example, so that citizens are able to define the type of energy they'd like to use, the form in which it's delivered, and some of the other market factors that sort of extend, you know, the benefits and participation and the growth in things like solar, you know, wind at a different scale. But we're just seeing so much more involvement of the off-takers that now we're seeing those city and state level priorities and policies being established that are inclusive of those factors. So it's really bringing more of the brokers to the table who are responsible for the implementation. You know, and I would encourage, if people are looking for innovative legislation, we've just seen a reversal in Maine and having a statewide commitment. As I mentioned, Hawaii is another example. There's really interesting work at the regulatory level being led by New York City, by New York State, as well as California. So there are really concrete examples, I think, of where we can point to successes that are setting the priorities from the top. While also being very inclusive of the offtake community, the people who are actually buying and consuming the power, to be active participants in helping to define, you know, what forms of energy, how to decarbonize, and how to really participate in these markets.
Okay, thanks. One more question. I'll start with Toby and then April, and then come to Lars, so in the order of presentation. Just in case the minister is asking you directly, what should the policymakers consider when designing policies to raise citizens' commitments and behavioral change? What is your most important message you want to give to the minister? I'd like to start with Toby.
Thank you. I think, you know, as environmental scientists, we're very accustomed to thinking about carbon in terms of budgets and the way that we must choose how to spend it. I think we need to think in a similar way with respect to behavior change. You know, behavior change is often hard work. It requires people's attention and focus. These are very precious resources. And ideally, most behavior change should feel like it's not behavior change. It's our job as policymakers to come up with solutions where the end goal is behavior change. But exactly as Lars says, you can't over-individualize the level of responsibility. It's not on individuals just to make different choices in the world as it currently is. That's hard work. It's not going to work. It's all about building the support around that. You need an entire ecosystem in which the desirable behavior is easy, it's normal, it's readily available, it's cheap. So that requires many, many different levers of policy, even though the problem might be defined quite narrowly in terms of getting people to buy electric cars or heat pumps or reduce their meat consumption. The solution is very broad and is about building that full supporting policy environment so that it really doesn't feel like behavior change. It just becomes the obvious thing to do.
Thanks a lot. So you're an engineer and psychologist, so that's quite an interesting combination, but I see it's more on the psychological side than on the technical side, your answer. But anyway, that was at least my impression. April, more or less the same question.
Absolutely. Toby, I think, really hit it out of the park. What we're seeing too is a really a varied application of things like building energy policy, you know, our building codes for the built environment, where we need, you know, a vast decarbonization in the thermal sector in particular. It's really, you know, senseless. It should be considered at a federal level and or, you know, broad sweeping implementation at the state level, that we consider policies that are sort of defaulted into ways that as Toby had alluded to, really remove that decision criteria from the individual user, where we need such broad scale transition. We should be thinking about comprehensive floors, you know, policies that enact sweeping change that actually signal some stability state by state. And I think that also means that, you know, we're not necessarily relying on the individual to make that decision. We're setting those standards, those minimum standards for industry, as we're thinking about how to transition everything from the vehicle fleets to, you know, decarbonizing the built environment, and then obviously encouraging the deployment of more renewable resources. But if we're going to achieve broad sweeping decarbonization, I think we really need to consider more of these types of policies that are as consistent and in line and up to date. For example, looking at comprehensive, you know, review of building energy codes.
Thank you, April. Before you mentioned that you also want to participate in the second session on citizens, so you're invited to do so and to contribute your knowledge to these discussions. Our bridge from the political side to the citizens more or less is last. That's why he's the last in the presentation, and that's why it's the last one we are asking to give his advice and to the minister.
I would say two things. Any policy you make an assessment of the effects it could have, the impacts it could have on behavior of the citizens, and also the policies you decide not to make, because they can be just as important. But the other thing I would say, make the needed efforts on inclusivity. It's not a cost, it's an investment. It will come back in reducement of the infrastructures you have to build, on the amount of petajoules you'll have to deliver, and so on. So it's an investment. It shouldn't be seen as a cost, and it's too often seen as a cost to involve people in policymaking.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much to all the speakers. We are in time. That's what is a little bit of a surprise, but it's good for the seminar. And I'd like to pass over to Johannes Tamburino. He is from the Project Management Jülich, Energy Strategies and System Analysis. He is responsible for R&D programs on energy systems in Germany. He's advising the German ministry, and he's the vice chair of the EGRD group. So he's working very close with Birte, and all the reports are also from your background and knowledge. So Johannes, session 2 is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Herbert, for the kind introduction. As Herbert already said, my name is Johannes Tamburino, working for Project Management Jülich in Germany, and I have the honor to be one of the vice chairs of the EGRD, and was strongly involved in the preparation of this seminar. So whereas in session 1, we primarily looked at how to design policies from the policy point of view. So what can governments do? Now in session 2, we take the exact opposite approach and look essentially at the role of citizens and communities in clean energy transition. And the main questions which we are interested in answering in this session are the following two. How much responsibility should governments, policymakers put on citizens and communities for reaching net zero emission objectives? And the second question we'd like to answer in our report, and where we are relying on the input from the talks and also the discussions, is what are the lessons learned from policies to encourage citizens to use energy more efficiently? So essentially, we now have a close look at the role of citizens and communities in energy transition. And we are very happy to have 3 excellent speakers in this session. We are a bit Eurocentric, which is not so good, but maybe afterwards in the discussion we can discuss how the results which we learned in this session also apply to other parts of the Earth. And we will start with a presentation by Marlene Sakaiken. And Marlene, she's assistant professor of sociology at the University of Geneva. She has a PhD in development studies and is and was engaged in many interdisciplinary research projects on food consumption and energy usage. And I'm very happy to have you here, Marilyn, and the floor is yours. 12 minutes for your presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. My name is Marlene Sahakian, and I'm a sociologist here at the University of Geneva. And in sociology, we have many tools for trying to understand different forms of consumption. So, for example, the buying of a red Ferrari or buying fashionable clothing, this we can associate with symbolic forms of consumption, conspicuous consumption. But the problem with energy is that much of our everyday life uses energy, but is not tied to these forms of more symbolic consumption. So if you think about your rituals this morning, perhaps you woke up, turned on the lights, prepared breakfast, checked your phones, checked your messages. All of these things consume energy, but they're part of mundane activities that have, let's say, that are difficult for people to give a lot of attention to. And it's precisely these mundane activities that I'm most interested in my own work. Next. So I'm going to present results of some research I've been doing now for the past 10, 15 years on household energy consumption. So really understanding the role of consumers and citizens in energy transitions. One project called Energize was about engaging households across Europe in living labs to achieve energy sufficiency. But before we started that project, we did a review of over 1,000 initiatives in Europe that are aimed at changing household energy use. And we organized them into a typology of change. We found, without much surprise, that a great majority of these initiatives are about changing technologies or changing individual behavior. The example here is the light bulb. You would change one light bulb for a more efficient bulb, or in terms of changing behavior, you might tell people to turn off a light when they're leaving the room. We found that these kinds of understandings of change, these problem framings, were somehow not very complex. We were not very satisfied with the degree of complexity. More complex are when initiatives try to change everyday life situations. They really work at the level of what people are doing in their everyday lives and try to change many different things in relation to those situations. And I'll give you some examples of that in a moment. Even more complex would be to change complex socio-material interactions. So not just focus on, let's say, the energy for preparing a meal, but starting to think about how provisioning for food has to do with mobility practices, for example, cutting across several consumption domains. Now, why is technological change and individual behavior change sort of unsatisfactory? Why do we need a bit more than telling people what to do or introducing more efficient technologies? Next slide, please. Here you have 2 images that were taken from fieldwork conducted in Switzerland as part of a large national research program in Switzerland around the energy transition. What you have on the left is an American style refrigerator. So in Switzerland, the standard Swiss fridge that you would have found at the end of the 20th century is perhaps a third of the size of this refrigerator. This refrigerator is highly energy efficient, but because of its larger volume, it is consuming more energy per unit, albeit for, it's cooling a larger volume of foods as well. But let's say appliances are getting bigger, and this is not, let's say, causing much surprise anymore. You can walk into someone's kitchen, see an American style refrigerator, and it would not necessarily shock you. On the right is an image that I reassure you is not at all, has not been normalized, a double dishwashing machine, this time in an elite household of 4 people in Geneva, in the Geneva area. This double dishwashing machine, of course, each machine is also very efficient, but here also you see trends towards more, bigger, and better appliances because they're more efficient, but none of this is leading us to absolute reductions in consumption, which are necessary when we think about sufficiency. Another problem, next slide please, with the individual behavior approach is that there's often a gap between information and action. So this gap occurs when people have enough information about, let's say, the environmental impacts of their consumption patterns, but they won't necessarily take the necessary actions to reduce that. There's another gap between action and impact. People might feel that they're acting in terms of reducing environmental impact or in terms of an ecological sensibility, but the actual impact of what they're doing is not leading us to the amount of reductions that are necessary. So here I've somewhat provocatively chosen the image of an advertising eco-conscious travel in Thailand, clearly, flying from Europe to Thailand to engage in an eco holiday may not be the kind of, reductions in energy usage that we want to see. One other issue sometimes with behavioral change approaches is that they tend to over-individualize environmental responsibility. So the ownership of making choices, or so-called free choices, which are not always free, tends to be down on the shoulder of individuals, disregarding the power dynamics behind producers, marketing agencies, advertisers, etc. Next slide, please. In that same study we did in Western Switzerland to try and understand how we might reduce energy usage on the right there, in this case, electricity usage in the home, we realized that energy in and of itself was not very meaningful. Very few people actually knew the amount of their energy bill. And yet, energy makes many things in everyday life possible and meaningful. And in this project, we started to see on the left things that did resonate with people and that led to certain forms of consumption over others. So we found that human health was very important to people, unfortunately more than planetary health. Notions of comfort, security, connectivity, convenience, freedom, these are things that are meaningful to people. And our suggestion coming out of this project was to say, if we want to reduce energy, perhaps we shouldn't be talking about energy at all, but talking about things that are meaningful to people, and then working our way back to try and understand how we could deliver the same services with less energy. Next slide, please. This brings me now to the framework that I use in my group with my research team when it comes to trying to understand problems around energy usage and co-design solutions. It is a social practice theory approach. It builds on the work of many others, such as Elizabeth Shove or Gordon Walker, Alan Ward, to name but a few. And here I'm going to take you to the Philippines. I actually did quite some field work in Metro Manila on practices around keeping cool. So in a climate where you have hot or even hotter temperatures throughout the year. And here, what I'm trying to demonstrate is that if you try and look at a practice such as keeping cool, which obviously can use air conditioning, right? It might also use fans or other means. Well, if you try and complexify that practice, there are at least 4 elements that should be taken into account. Clearly, material arrangements are important. We want to look at passive ventilation in buildings, whether or not there's a possibility for natural shading, the types of cooling and technologies, and hopefully very efficient technologies. Certainly, we need efficiency to achieve sufficiency. But on the bottom right there, we also need to be grappling with social norms. What are the standards around workplace attire? What representations do people have of seasonality, of fashion, etc.? On the bottom left there, we also look at people's competencies and skills. How do they ventilate their homes? How do they create cool spaces by different activities in their homes? How do they refresh bodies? And top left, to not disregard social relations in the workplace, but also in terms of living with others, care responsibilities, etc. This approach was applied, next slide please, in the Energize project that I mentioned earlier that just ended at the end of 2019. For Energize, we engaged with the social practice approach to understand energy usage in relation to heating and laundry. And here I'm showing some results related to the heating challenge. We engaged people over a 4-week period across 300 households to reduce indoor temperatures to 19 degrees at the very end of the year, so fall, winter period, over 4 weeks. Many of them did not attain 19 degrees. For many, it was uncomfortable, but almost all households were able to reduce by at least 1 degree across the board, and even more so in bedrooms. 1.5 to 2 degrees in bedrooms was achievable and was still considered to be comfortable. In fact, in bedrooms, people found that sleeping in a colder environment contributed to better sleep and better health. What you're seeing on the right there are thermostat living room temperatures from a baseline period through the challenge and at a follow-up period that took place about 3 to 4 months after the challenge across these different countries. So what we like about this change initiative is that it was a voluntary initiative. People decided for themselves what targets that they would engage in such a target, and they engaged in some form of reflexivity where we asked them to challenge standards around indoor comfort, notably the idea that you should be heating people rather than heating spaces. So how to keep bodies warm rather than your couch warm. And also the idea that perhaps we should be going towards more microclimate diversity, at least here in the context of Europe, wearing a sweater indoors in the winter and not coming to a situation where, as it is now in many households, there's an indoor temperature of some 20, 22 degrees throughout the year, wearing t-shirts throughout the year indoors, etc. Next slide, please. As I've mentioned to you, I've been working on this question of energy usage for a number of years now, but I always started from the point of constraints, negative impacts, etc. And increasingly, there is a turn, I feel, in sustainability studies to not only start from the question of resource limits, the need to reduce, etc., but thinking about sustainable well-being as the normative aim. So well-being here is about meeting human needs, satisfying human needs, such as feeling safe, being part of a community, living in an agreeable environment, developing as a person, or feeling free. And what we're now trying to do with a brand new project supported by the Swiss Federal Office of Energy, but also a new project starting in May, part of the Horizon 2020 package called Dialogues, is that we're trying in both of those projects to think about how well-being relates to energy citizenship and how we can engage people to be thinking about energy futures that are sufficient in terms of achieving net zero by 2050 or even earlier if possible, by starting from this point of well-being and then working our way back to understand what energy is needed to achieve well-being for all people, with this idea that meeting people's needs might be less energy intensive than meeting everyone's untrammeled desires. Next and last slide. To summarize, what I try to put forward in my work and with my group is to think about how to change practices collectively, that individual behavior change, let's say in its more limited interpretation of telling people what to do, and techno fixes alone will not suffice. To achieve energy sufficiency, we need to recognize how energy relates to everyday life dynamics. So this was the social practice theory approach that I shared, thinking about material arrangements, skills and competencies, etc. Second, perhaps instead of starting from environmental constraints, we could start thinking of well-being as a normative aim. What will the good life look like in 2050 at net zero emissions? And finally, imposed restrictions may be useful. We're seeing changes in energy usage around COVID-19 and different forms of confinement. But forms of self-limitation that come through participatory methods that encourage reflexivity are highly promising. And this was some of the things we heard earlier in the session that just preceded this one. So process matters, problem framing matters, what normative aims matter. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Marilyn. So since we are a bit over time, I just have one question right now, and maybe the other ones we discuss later in the overall discussion. So thanks for the presentation. You gave a very broad overview of the research that is going on, and also on the different factors that need to be taken into account. So from your point of view, if you would have to name one factor, from your point of view, what is a main factor that needs to be taken into account to bring citizens and communities to overthink their energy consumption behavior? So for us, if we need to write something in the report and we need to make it precise, what is the main factor you want us to consider?
We really must situate energy usage into everyday life activities. For me, that's the starting point. We have to understand how energy is related to much of the mundane and routinized activities that make up our lives. And these go way beyond just individuals making choices. We must consider systems of provision. We must consider material arrangements, infrastructures, social norms, etc.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
So then we will continue with our second presentation. The second presentation is by Roman Seidel. And Roman Seidel is working at the University of Hannover right now in the nuclear waste topic. But he has a long history in energy research, graduated in psychology, worked for a long time at the ETH in Zurich in the transdisciplinary lab, and then had a brief interrelation at the Öko-Institut in Freiburg in Germany. And we're happy to have you here today, Roman, and we're looking forward to your presentation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much for the invitation to giving this brief talk in this webinar. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Yes, I will report about work that stems from my time at the ETH. It was in at this. It doesn't work. It was in a project which was funded by the National Science Foundation, and I will dive into one of the papers we wrote there. This was a questionnaire study where we tried to go into what energy sufficiency could mean and potential behavior change of in the 3 Swiss cities. Perhaps the background is interesting because this project was initially the initial idea was about using formal social groups to trying to bring interventions for more energy sufficiency among the citizens, because the question is, how do you reach out for citizens? And this is a perspective from a city, and we closely collaborate with 3 Swiss cities in this project. So I think this was kind of transdisciplinary thing, and I was reminded by some mentions from Lars that this was could be quite similar, like this empowering citizens and so on. So the question is how to get into the citizens, but this paper was more about the potential. So what are doing people now, energy related behavior, and what is their potential? And what we found out is just a brief summary and overview before, that we could group behavior, or call it practices or activities that are energy related, that they can be grouped. And those also, they on the one hand, they offer more or less potential for change. So by intervention, it would be easier to change them, or it would be really hard because people stick to it very much. And on the other hand, these behaviors contribute significantly to the energy demand reduction or decarbonization in general. So this is a bit the challenge. And then we found also that the citizens can be grouped according to their current demands and practices. But then we looked in, okay, what is the potential of these specific groups? So for instance, people having a high energy demand, why is that? And probably they are able to change to
arrangements whereby you can do Zoom class. With this technology, there's no way they even need to try kids to class, they're still online.
Future behavior. I hope everybody's muted. Is everything okay? So and the issue we found is that, yeah, well, you have the easiness of change versus the lock-in problem, and where to put an intervention from a city perspective. So this was a question, because you have always a combination of behavior and individual situation, just as Marlene said before. You have a certain context or a certain lifestyle, you can name it. So diving into the study, this is the one step, the grouping of potential future behaviors of, and on the left side you see in this table there are behaviors like car sharing or sharing toolkits and so on, and we found we could order that thematically, and we used a factor analysis to analyze our data, and what came out was that in factor 1, yes, you can see that there are certain behaviors that are answered by all the responses in a quite similar way. So these items, I would say, belong together. And there's another factor where it's more about the things you do at your home, yeah, like switching off lights, showering, or airing the rooms. And then we found, well, there are 2 points which could not be really subsumed into cluster 1 or in the factor 1 or 2, which is washing and working at home. And probably this is because these things are more context specific. So it's not really clear yet, but probably washing has to do with, do I own a washing machine at all? Or working at home. I mean, this is now more common thanks to COVID-19, but at that time it was probably not really clear for everybody, and probably there is some issue there with the possibility to work at home. Then coming to the grouping of respondents. Well, first we identified individuals who display quite similar behavioral patterns, who behave quite similar, so to speak. And then, and this is what you see here in this table, we identified a behavioral change potential for each of these clusters. So we used a cluster analysis to group the people, and then we looked, okay, what is their potential? I do not go into the method in detail now because I don't have the time, but if you are interested in that, because this I think was a nice twist, how you can measure these kind of things, feel free to ask me and I'll send you the paper. So what you see here is, well, you saw the factor ratings on the previous slide. Now you see these variables here are ordered according to these factor numbers. And in the table, the mean values here are ordered in a way, so the higher the number, the more non-sufficient, or let's say the lower the mean value here is, the more sufficient. Let's go into that. Cluster 1, we named homeowners with a car affinity. Why? Yeah, well, these were guys who were really fond of their cars. They owned at least 1 or 2, some even more. And they owned their house or their apartment. And they had quite a high standard of living, and they were not really fond of sharing cars. Cluster 2, they gave that impression that they like a high standard of living, but there may be some hint of conscious consumption, not only conspicuous consumption, but also conscious consumption. So we think that there might be some potential there. Then cluster 3, which is already sufficient. You can see this at the numbers. This is quite sufficient in our numerology here. And cluster 4, well, this is a middle group, we called it, because it was somewhere in between all the other clusters. But here we identified a clear potential for future change to the more sustainable, more sufficient behavior. So let's compare, for instance, for the topic of sharing. I mean, car sharing was not really a topic for the cluster 1 because they disliked this idea. And the same, I would say, also for cluster 2. And also the sharing of tools, well, this is also sometimes context dependent. Some people like to own their own tools. I only use my own hammer. I don't want to lend it to the neighbor because I'm not sure if everything works well, and so on. So maybe some people are hesitant, but there's a clear gradient from cluster 2 to cluster 4 and 3. So these cluster 3 and 4, they are more receptive, I would say, for thinking about sharing. Yeah, going to the conclusions. What have we found out with this paper? Well, actually, we have found thematic sets of energy consumption behavior, and those behaviors are more or less, yeah, easy to change. But then you also have the dimension that these present more or less potential for reduction of energy consumption. And usually those things that have a bigger potential to reduce energy demand, they are the hardest to change. Especially for groups like with the habit of flying to faraway places for vacation, or having a huge apartment. So clusters 1 and 2. So we had the idea of targeting medium group activities, which are neither too trivial or nor too hard to change. For instance, sharing toolkits, rooms, and cars. It's becoming more and more common, but it's not the mainstream yet. But perhaps if you carefully introduce this to avoid reactance, it could be an option for some of the people. Of course, you have a diagnostic problem here because you have to have a knowledge about to which cluster a person belongs, and then you know, how can I address him or this household. But the idea of giving them possibilities to try something out, for instance, serving them with e-bikes, which they can trade in for their cars for some weeks at least, and try how it is to drive with an e-bike. And there is a study done within the project, and well, the results are quite promising. So people like the e-bike, and some of them who participated in the study, they even bought one after this intervention. But still, we do not really know if this is generalizable, because it may be that people like the e-bike because they have tried it and they like it, but they not substitute their car with the bicycle, but the old car with the old bike, which is not electrified. Then a last point on the behavior, because you have also different contexts. I mean, working at home and owning a washing machine and using for laundry, this has to do with habits, but also it has to do with structural issues, because are you allowed to work at home? Is it possible? What kind of job do you have? I mean, now, and this is then the last point on this slide, probably we have to look for windows of opportunity. Well, I'm not quite sure of if COVID-19 is actually a window of opportunity for more sustainable or more sufficient behavior. Well, work from home or reducing the vacation activity. It can be that maybe there is a rebound effect on the vacation issue, that people like to go out again, and then you have everybody flying again. But for working from home, probably if you learn to like it, some people already, I know some surveys that they say, well, they would like to work from home 2 or 3 days. And this window of opportunity idea is, I mean, also for the daily business, probably people who move from one city to another, they actually have a life event. They actually are changing something. And probably if the receiving city says, well, we have this car sharing in our city, probably you are interested and you can try it. You can just try it for some weeks. And this would be something you can advertise to use this changing this changing opportunity, so to speak. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. And here's some further publication from the project. These are those where I was involved in, but when you could go to the address at the Swiss National Science Foundation to the project, then there are some more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roman, for the in-depth presentation of the results of your project, where you looked at many different aspects. So maybe one question to you right now. So you looked at all the different technologies and all the different behaviors and classified the users. In which area do you see the highest potential for behavioral change in citizens' behavior towards energy consumption? If you had to name one area of all those you mentioned.
Well, I'm really not sure if there is one area. I think that this middle area where there are things like showering or reducing room temperature, I think this would be something, things that you can easily do at home. This is one part you can easily address by some interventions, or people can try it just as in the presentation with from Marlene. But things like who have a bigger impact, I would say, like meat consumption and reduction of living space. This is harder. This is harder, and yeah, they really have to think about. But of course, the potential would be bigger. So this is the more interesting thing, I would say.
Are you also afraid to see a huge rebound effect in this topic?
I'm not sure. I think, as I said, for the working from home, I think if the infrastructure becomes better, I see. I'm currently living also in Switzerland, so they have less problems. But some people who in remote areas, they have problems with Zooming and so on. But in Germany, we have this frequently with my German colleagues. So the infrastructure has to be better, and then we can zoom along. But and I don't have to travel so much. So this is on the one hand nice, yeah. But for vacation and so on, and moving to a house in Sweden or wherever, I mean, this is something which is on the downside. And as soon as it is possible to experience this again, so people will go on vacation again.
Thank you very much. So then we continue to the third and last talk in this session on citizen and communities. And we're happy to have Thor Håkan Jöksson Inderberg here. Sorry for probably mispronouncing your name. Thor Håkan is a senior researcher fellow at the Fridtjof Nansen Institute and associate professor at the University of Oslo, and has a PhD in political science. And currently he is in the leadership group of the Include Research Center for Socially Inclusive Energy Transition. And there he leads the project Land Use Change and Changing Wind Power Governments. And he will give a presentation, especially also on this Include project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Johannes, for that kind introduction. Can all of you see my slide here now?
Yes, we can see your slides and can hear you very well. Thank you.
Excellent. Let me know if there's any problems with that. Thanks for inviting me to do this. I'm going to give you a little bit of an ambitious presentation, in the sense that I'm going to try to give you some examples of from the research center Include. Hopefully that can inform the topics of this section. This research center, I'll present a little bit more about that. It's an 8-year project or a full research center, so it will be some quite strong selection by us, some of the projects and findings that I will be able to present here. What I'll talk about is first why Include, the grounding for what we are doing and why we're doing this. I will have to say a little bit about what Include is, the research center. I'll give a taste of underlying projects, 3 particular projects, and how they hopefully relate to some of the insights that we are discussing here today. before I point to some implications for energy transitions and also particularly policy implications, hopefully. So moving on, why include? It's really a twofold grounding where we're looking at the social factors and implications of the clean energy transitions in their own right for social implications. So we think it's important to keep in mind that while we are transitioning, we need to seek to avoid aggravate already existing grievances and also to create new grievances. There will be challenges, likely challenges to social inequalities and other issues connected to these clean energy transitions. So this is one of the two groundings for include. The other one is really about the social barriers. They could be behavioral or acceptance issues or similar. The barriers that are there based on social factors to the clean energy transitions from happening. So we need to keep an eye on those too. Often we tend to speak of the barriers, but I think these two reasons for the Include Center are equally valid, and they also influence each other's. I should also mention that we tend to, in our center, we tend to look at the social, at energy transition, not at one transition, but at several, and they overlap and connect in different ways. So we have transitions not just from decarbonization, but also from digitalization, decentralization tendencies, and so on. So we think of them as complex units and processes, open-ended processes as well. The research center is led by University of Oslo. I'm a member of the lead management group, but Tanya Winter, if you can see her up top left in the picture, she's leading the center. We're only into the second year. So we started last year. We've been going on for 1 year. Going on for 8 years altogether, with 22 user partners, industry co-financing the center, 7 research institutions. I'll just pass quickly through this. We're currently 41 ongoing sub-projects under this, and we are defining new ones as we go. So we have quite a bit of flexibility to pick up some of the challenges concerning clean energy transitions during the process of the whole center. We're currently 7 PhDs, but we are recruiting more as we speak. Include is organized in different ways, and I'm not going to talk much about this figure, but I wanted to give you a little bit of an idea about the focus. I'm leading the work on energy systems in transition, which you see at the top there. We also have 2 other work packages on substantial empirical focus. It's energy space and flows, analyzing urban development and mobility, and we have municipalities as change agents. So these are the 3 pillars, empirical and empirical focus of areas of Include. I wanted to give you a taste here of 3 selected example studies that we are doing under Include. These are not finished, so it's a bit preliminary focus, but the first one here is about flexibility, flexible energy consumption measures in households. These are enabled by a full rollout in Norway of smart meters. So they measure and report hourly energy consumption, electricity consumption, rather in all Norwegian households, and report to a central hub. That enables the ability to establish some policies, national level policies for influencing flexibility in energy use. That ultimately could be through grid tariffing. It could be what we have also been studying under this here is sort of nudging approaches like text messages and other measures, and also visual feedback to the consumer. But what is pointed to is that this is needed in all developed future electricity systems, really. So we're, at least in Norway, we're in kind of an infancy in developing the policies for this. What we have found is that the individual potential for electricity flexibility use, flexible electricity use is highly varying, meaning that some groups tend to have a lot of flexibility, and they can move loads and invest also in systems to handle this automatically. Whereas others, they don't, based on infrastructure and other the context around them, which has been covered by some of the other presentations previously. We find that the policy development has not yet been able to account for these differences, nor have they really mapped it. And we miss this. This is an important lesson, I think, from this study. We do see that some groups are significantly, potentially significantly disadvantaged by pressure, while other groups may reap the benefits of it. And it has also a potential to inhibit the potential for flexibility that can be reached with a better designed policy at the household level. Moving on to wind power licensing. This is a highly controversial issue, turned controversial over the last 2-3 years in Norway. Wind power has increased from almost nothing to 10% of Norway's annual electricity production of a total of 153 terawatt hours. But some problems with planning processes in Norway, licensing schemes and siting, have led to acceptance issues that are quite significant. But at least as important, this is not just aggregated individuals, it's also seen in communities and particularly in municipalities who have turned around completely. And this is very significant because it might lead to some potential significant barriers for energy transition, where the main strategy in Norway for decarbonization is really through electrification. And there is a need for more electricity, and land-based wind power is one of the main sources for this. So we find that the policies for surrounding licensing and wind power planning, they have not considered some quite significant justice concerns relating to recognition of groups and perspectives, procedures around the licensing and inclusion of different perspectives and groups have not been done what it should do to reach its potential, and there are distributive issues there as well. And this leads to a lack of legitimacy and ultimately challenges for the electrification and clean energy transition. Last example is a quite narrow case study we did of which you can see the picture to the bottom right, where we focus on one particular municipality in the southeastern Norway. We have gone forward to establish some quite significant solutions in a particular school, a high school. So this involves a number of investments that does not make sense, including a hydrogen storage for seasonal storage of energy between winter and summer, produced by the photovoltaics on the rooftop that you can see on the picture. So we have analyzed what influences and what barriers have been present and how can they overcome these. And we find that organizational form is actually quite a significant factor for enabling and motivating a municipality to do these kind of things. They have been able to take investments out of political influence, so in the more short term, and they have made long-term financial independency of this the municipality company who has done this. Actually, it's and so there's also a significant link to local and identity in this particular town that leads to a motivation for doing this. And we believe that this can focus on these kind of actors and communities can, through local government, can be a feasible way to inform policy as well for transitions. We have some indicative conclusions based on this. Some of them are quite provocative, perhaps, and these are indicative because we still have 7 years to go. And our claim is that social factors are actually largely seen to be outside of the electricity sector's mandate in general. This means that the electricity sector or the energy sector more widely has not really been too concerned about social implications of changes in policy. That has been put out to other sectors in society and other parts of public administration. But in order to facilitate a transition, it's necessary to consider both the implications, the social implications of the transitions that are ongoing, but also but also to identify these social barriers when shaping policy. So it is important to include social factors in this. Individual and collective agency can and do represent barriers. I have given some examples, so I won't elaborate further on that. And transitions have the potential for creating significant justice issues that leads to legitimacy issues that we have seen in our studies. So I'll leave it at that because time is short. We are going to investigate further on the more specific details on how this works in different contexts. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this presentation. So you presented a brief overview of many of the different studies which you have performed. I think one interesting aspect which was not so much covered by the other two presentations was the role of the communities versus the role of the individual citizen. So maybe one question to you from your experience and the things you have learned in all these studies. What can communities do to support citizens with their efforts in clean energy transition? So is there a general advice which you could give from the things you have learned?
We haven't. I think what we have seen is communities as barriers. I think I would have to relate it a little bit to some of the other acceptance issues and inclusive approaches. And I think the deliberate aspects of communities is a very crucial element when going ahead. Also, we see from the municipality that is actually some of the dynamics there resemble, even if it's a formal organization in local government, there are some dynamics there that resemble community approaches to transitions and behavioral change. And I think that linking that, the interlinkages between policy development and the social dynamics within the communities is a crucial element that is also the topic here of the session that you launched.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to open the discussion, at least the remaining 6 minutes we have, and ask or pose one question to all of the three presenters. And that is a question looking at an international perspective. So when we look into behavior and behavioral aspects in the energy transition, then culture plays a big role. So how transferable are the results of which you presented today to other countries or other cultures, for example, Asia? First to Marilyn, please.
Yes, thank you. Well, I presented the case of keeping cool in Metro Manila. I think as a sociologist, when you're going into a different city or crossing out into other countries and you're trying to understand energy in relation to everyday life, you must, of course, account for the specific socio-material arrangements in that context. You want to understand social norms and how they play out, standards, what technologies are available or not, etc. So the starting point would be contextualizing, I would say.
Thank you very much. So essentially the same question to Roman.
Yeah, this is a good point. I think, and always with Switzerland, if you want to publish a Swiss study in international journals, you're always asked, yeah, well, this is a small country and how transferable are your results? I think that's a good point. What we saw from our samples in the 3 cities, they at least they were very different cities, a smaller one and a bigger one and so on. But the results were quite similar. So we could pool all the respondents. Just for one city, it was Zug. They have an exceptionally high standard of living, such in Zurich and Geneva. And they were particularly fond of cars. And you see this also when you go through the city, and this may be something very specific for this city, yeah. And of course, these kind of things you have to have in mind when you go to other countries and also other cities. You always have to respond to the question, well, my sample is this and that, and there are some results that can be generalized, and some I would be cautious, because you always have to look at the very specific the social structure and the preferences there, and this can really be very different according to specific culture.
Thank you very much. So not exactly the same question, but a similar one to Tor Håkon. So do you think that initiatives which could be installed by communities or by citizens to engage other citizens in climate mitigation and energy transition? So do you think that there are some blueprints which more or less can be used in different countries, or is it really individual on a case-by-case basis?
I think I'll have to answer that question a little bit differently, because Norway is a slightly peculiar case in some regards, having already decarbonized its electricity sector. So I think some of the main lessons from the case of Norway and what's happening in Norway is perhaps the challenges that arise with, for example, electrifying other areas of society with a deeper decarbonization. And so when you have a clash of legal structures, for example, and I know this is operating on a slightly different perspective than your question was directed at, but what's down the road in some areas, when after all the systems have decarbonized to a larger extent, the electricity sector is quite valid lessons, I think, and perhaps it's possible to learn from some of Norway's mistakes. This also translates into some of the challenges with individual and community behavior in Norway, because there's not really that many community initiatives. This is partly, I think, because the government is quite active, and both at local and national level, but also because it's reasonably cheap electricity in the first place, and also decarbonized. So already, specifically the electricity sector. So it's some of the lessons are perhaps very useful and some are less useful from the Norwegian case.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Yeah, so thank you again to all the 3 presenters for great presentations, for great answers of the questions, and I'd like to ask you to maybe read through the chat, and if there are any questions which were posed to you specifically, then feel free to just answer them and let the others participate on what you think. Then we can close session number 2 and go to session number 3, which will be moderated by Atsushi Kurosawa, who is also one of the vice chairs besides me of the EGRT. And Atsushi Kurosawa is a director at the Institute of Applied Energy in Japan and has led many energy and environment related projects, has held visiting fellowships and positions at many universities in Japan and also internationally, and is active in the EGRD since many years. So Atsushi, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. So I don't need to introduce myself. So this session 3, is the we deal with the data issues and also the methodological issue of the behavioral change modeling. So session focuses on approaches to access better data and to model people's behavior in the context of deep decarbonization pathways. It will look at lessons learned from social sciences and how to integrate these into energy modeling. So there are two framing questions. One is how we can access data to better understanding how policy and technology progress impact behavioral change in society. The second question is how can we learn from behavioral and other scientific areas and integrate behavior change into technology adoptions and social diffusion modeling. So I'd like to introduce the first speaker. First speaker is the Dr. Naoko Doi. She is the group manager of the Energy Efficiency Group, Climate Change and Energy Efficiency Unit, the Institute of Energy Economics, Japan. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, for the kind introduction. I just want to know my slide is shown properly.
Yes.
Can you see my slide? Okay. All right. And thank you very much for the kind introduction. My name is Naoko Doi. My presentation is about the impact of Setsuden data survey on the potential for Japan's electricity savings by behavioral change. And so first of all, what is Setsuden? Setsuden is a Japanese word. It's about electricity savings resulting from technical operation efficiency improvement, including behavioral change. As you might know very well, to cope with the rolling blackout after the Great Eastern Japan earthquake happened in 2011, Ministry requested industry, commercial, and residential consumers to facilitate electricity peak savings. I mean, for the large scale users, this is more or less mandatory, but for commercial residential consumers, small scale ones, it's more of voluntary action is being facilitated. So behavior change for peak electricity savings and consumption savings prompted by emergency situation in 2011 seems to have a kind of a lasting impact until now. If you take a look at the right-hand side top figure, this one compares the weather-adjusted peak electricity savings rate for the time between July and September in 2011 to 2014, meaning the comparison with 2010, which is a pre-earthquake level. Each year, TEPCO Tokyo Electric Power Company area and the TEPCO Kansai Electric Power Company area peak level has achieved almost a 10% lower level compared with a pre-earthquake situation. And if you take a look at the bottom figure, this is kind of a continuing actions for residential electricity savings after 2011 up to 2013. You see, for instance, shorter air conditioner operational hours, adjustment on air conditioner temperature, etc. So the size of the sort of action is getting slightly smaller compared with the right after the earthquake situation. However, you understand that the continuation of the behavior change being implemented as facilitated right after the earthquake. So in order to cope with the emergency situation, we worked together with other think tank research institutions, including Energy Conservation Center, Jukankyo Research Institute, and Dentsu, to implement the study called Energy Elasticity Demand and Potential for Peak Demand Savings. The study is commissioned by Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry And we have published nearly 900-page report on the detailed analysis for the 10 regions in Japan. What we have done is to survey and then also measure the actual electricity consumption by appliances and technologies for households and the 10,000 building owners occupants for 3 different seasons, including summer, middle season, which is spring and autumn, and the winter in 10 regions in Japan. And building on this study, we estimated load curve for 3 different seasons in 10 regions in Japan, and then list up menus of peak demand saving options. And then estimated potential for electricity savings for 3 seasons in 10 regions for both residential and the commercial sector. And then consider method for information diffusion that can facilitate behavior change for 3 seasons in 10 regions. Today's my presentation cover only the results on the residential sector due to the time limitation. If you take a look at the report, which is written in Japanese, we have menus and then impacts of setsuden for the commercial sector as well. So on your left-hand side, I have shown you the stepwise approach to estimate a load curve by region. In the top part, you see that the surveyed data for appliances ownership, operational hours, and the surveyed information on the usage by appliances, and combined with our literature analysis on the rated power consumption by appliance by type of residential building, etc. Combined with the temperature information, we estimated the operational hours and for hourly electricity consumption per household by region, by household, by residential type of building. And then also we have estimated the electricity consumption for detached house or apartments. And then also we have estimated electricity consumption for different sort of number of household, number of people per household. And finally, we made a comparison with those estimated number with the measured data to derive hourly electricity consumption for the residential sector by region for 3 seasons. The right-hand side figure shows you the estimated load curve reserved by appliances for the time period in summer. You understand how different appliances are differently utilized in 10 regions, and then peak consumption level is quite different, and the timing is also quite different. I mean, in order to highlight the differences, I'd like to show you this figure in this slide, regional differences and the seasonal differences. On the top part, on the left-hand side, I just show you Kanto summer peak hours, which appliances are contributing. And the right-hand side is the Hokkaido, northern part of Japan, which appliances are contribute to what extent. You see there's a great difference in terms of the contribution by appliances. The Kanto, the neighboring region in Tokyo and then surrounding prefectures, during the summertime, due to the hot summer, air conditioner contributes the greatest. Nearly half of the peak electricity demand comes from air conditioner, followed by refrigerator and the rice cooker, etc. But in contrast, of course, Hokkaido, the temperature is much lower, so that to the peak, the air conditioner contribution is much smaller. But in contrast, if you take a look at the winter situation, Kanto area air conditioner contribution is 23%, followed by refrigerator, etc. And then also there are more diverse usage of the appliances for the heating purposes. For instance, FF stove, which is mainly heated by the kerosene or city gas. However, in order to switch on, turn on these appliances, electricity consumption is needed. So we included this estimation, this electricity requirements. And the other, perhaps a Japan-specific appliances utilized for the purpose of the heating during the winter time includes electric carpet, electric floor heating, kotatsu, which is the kind of a table covered with blanket, and the inside is heated, etc. And so Hokkaido, most of the heating is coming from either city gas or the kerosene-based heating. So the peak comes in the morning time, and then refrigerator's contribution is the largest, followed by road heating. I mean, because the snow is piled up during the winter time. So outside of the house, they use a road heating to melt the snow. So it's quite important to understand the what appliances and technologies are utilized. And it's quite important to understand the local, regional differences to have effective policy options to facilitate the behavior change. And on your right-hand side, peak hours, the by season is quite different, mainly based on the climate weather condition differences. Okay, so as I mentioned to you, it's quite important to understand the characteristics, local conditions, regional differences in terms of the electricity consumption and operational patterns of the appliances. Based on the understanding of this one, we have established this menu list of electricity savings and impact. In fact, this menu list is the basic ones. And as I mentioned to you at the initial part of the presentation, the study is implemented to prepare for the emergency situation. So we have other lists, more stringent sort of measures, and the menus are prepared for the purpose of coping with the emergency situation. However, this is the basic list that consumers can implement to the normal daily life. For preparing this menu list, we have conducted interviews with manufacturing companies. And then also we have done literature survey. And then also we have invited experts to our committee meeting. And then to see if this assumption is kind of reasonable or not, and the impacts are reasonable or not. We have this kind of a discussion stage to have an estimation on the impact of electricity savings. For example, you see that the air conditioner maintain temperature, room temperature at 28 degrees during the summertime, use blind at the window, use fan to minimize the use of air conditioner, or refrigerator set temperature at the middle level and minimize the frequency of door opening and close, and do not put too much stuff inside. So these very small sort of efforts of behavior change can pile up to generate substantial electricity savings at the end. But in order to make an assessment, we take a step-by-step approach. So these assumptions are validated. I mean, electricity savings rate, for example, this is, for example, the maintain room temperature at 28 degrees Celsius. And then electricity consumption can be saved by 14%. Use blind at the window, and then air conditioner electricity can be saved by 10%, etc. So this is the meaning. And then this peak demand savings rate is a contribution to reduce the peak demand for summer, spring, autumn, and winter is estimated for the 10 regions in Japan. So as a result of this detailed assessment of the demand pattern, ownership, and the operational information, as well as the expert knowledge provided on the technological operational improvement facilitated by behavior change, we made estimation on the impact of behavior change for electricity peak savings. I mean, again, as a representative cases for you to understand, we have picked up the Hokkaido and the Kanto cases as a representation of those analyzed cases. If all those menus are implemented during summer, middle season, and winter, in the case of Kanto, neighboring regions in Tokyo area, as high as 3,000 megawatt, 3 gigawatt of electricity during the peak hours can be saved. In terms of the savings potential, it could amount to 6.1%. So 6.1 may sound small, however, it would have a great impact that can avoid about 3 units of nuclear power plant operation during the peak hours. Possible means if we apply those who are not regularly implementing the behavior change for electricity savings, implement those actions in the menu list, could avoid about nearly 2 gigawatt of electricity during the peak hours. So, and then emergency, if those who do not often or not implement the electricity savings cope with the emergency call from ministries or electric utility companies, they will probably lead to additional 0.5% of potential peak savings. So each of the menu list would be, the contribution would be very small. But as a result of all the entire efforts being piled up, it would have a significant impact on the electricity savings. Then aside from this quantitative analysis, we have done a study to consider appropriate methods for information diffusion to increase consumers' awareness. Mainly this approach is done by Dentsu Corporation. They have used this digital signage shown nearby the station or the shopping centers, so that people can just pass by and see on a daily basis the information such as how to implement electricity savings, like replace with LED or setting temperature at 28 degrees Celsius, etc. Information is provided along with other information such as earthquake or tsunami situation or weather situation. And then this one, green one, shows electricity demand and supply situation is very stable, etc. So daily basis, if consumers are exposed to this kind of information, they become more aware of the need for electricity savings, as shown in the results. I mean, this is the response. Those who have seen digital signage and then what their sort of understanding or what their interests are and what their the actions taken after their signage is being requested to be answered, and then they responded positively to have seen, to have been exposed to this kind of information. So finally, let me summarize the implications or key messages out of this study. A list of options for Setsuden behavior change for electricity peak savings should be prepared based on local characteristics and good understanding of how appliances technologies are utilized. Second, the appropriate method of information provision should be tailored to meet regional characteristics. Third, the estimation potential for Setsuden electricity savings at the demand side can benefit the supply side because it can avoid unnecessary investment at generation, transmission, and distribution. Lastly, the purpose of listing up those options for behavioral change involve emergency preparedness, and the load leveling for economic purpose. Nevertheless, both would have a significant impacts on CO2 emissions reductions. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. So time is very limited, so I'd like to skip the question. And please write the chat area for the questions for Doi-san, so she could answer that. So I'd like to introduce our next presenter, Charlie Wilson. He is a professor in energy and climate change, Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research, University of East Anglia from UK. Charlie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Can I just check you can see my slide okay and hear me okay?
Yes. Good.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to be talking more about how we might try and simulate the sorts of behavioral changes we've been hearing about in the workshop, how we might simulate these in models, particularly those models used for analyzing global climate mitigation, such as the net zero target that the IEA is discussing in its own modeling work. So hold on a minute, sorry. There we go. So the first thing to say is to really kind of repeat what we've heard already, that social and behavioral change is absolutely critical. And so it's important that we try and include it as best we can in the quantitative analysis we do. This pie chart is from the UK Committee on Climate Change's report to the UK government on a pathway towards net zero by 2050. And you can see that the green wedge is the measures that the Committee on Climate Change considers to be largely social and behavioral, and the blue wedge, which together with the green wedge make up about 2/3 of the measures, have some social and behavioral dimension. So clearly social and behavioral change is critically important for net zero. Now, how do we approach this in models? Well, there are really 4 different ways I'm going to walk you through. The first distinction is to introduce some model jargon, this distinction between what we call exogenous and endogenous. And exogenous means essentially something that's specified or described externally to the models. And we do this in our scenario work through the use of storylines or narratives, which describe the arc of future change. There's then endogenous, which are internally represented relationships and processes within the model code itself. You can also then think about behavior either implicitly, that is, you kind of bundle it up with a much more general kind of phenomenon, or you can actually specifically represent some behavioral change or behavioral process itself. So this gives you 2 by 2 opportunities for modeling behavior. Now, the implicit ways of doing it, where really you kind of capture behavior as part of a more general phenomenon, we already do quite well in the models used for these global climate mitigation analysis. And we do it quite well, particularly for economically responsive behavior. So for example, we commonly assume in models that future demand for energy services like mobility, like heating, like cooling, like many of the things we've been hearing about today, we assume that our demand for those services will rise as a function of GDP growth. And this is based on very robust historical relationships between income and energy service demand. So there's lots and lots of behavioral stuff going on as to why, when we have more money, we consume more services. But we can really represent that in an aggregate sense through this approach. If you then look in the bottom left corner as an example of an endogenous approach, we commonly use in models what's called a price elasticity. So this is that when a good or a service becomes more expensive, we demand less of it. And when it becomes cheaper, we demand more of it. Again, very robust empirical evidence from economics. And this is an example of a behavioral phenomenon which we capture already well in the models. But it's really this right-hand side where we're trying to capture behavioral phenomena explicitly that is the research frontier in our kind of modeling world. So if you look on the top right, we're looking at examples where you take a scenario narrative and you try and translate that as best you can into behavioral assumptions or parameters. And I'll give you some examples of those from some work I've been involved with. And my colleague Baz from EASA, who's going to follow my talk, will give you some more examples. And then the bottom right is where you actually try and enshrine or capture some behavioral relationship within the model code itself. And I'll give you an example of that in relation to social influence. So first off, on consumption options, this graph is from a paper by a group of authors last year who looked at the empirical literature to see the mitigation potential for a range of behavioral options, or what they called consumption options. So if you look down the list, these are all related to transport. You'll see lots of familiar things that we've been talking about today. And in a modeling context, it's very useful to distinguish what we call activity, structure, and intensity when looking at these behavioral options. So activity is where you have, well, could I possibly ask, there's a bit of background noise from someone. Could I possibly ask that you mute your talk? Thank you. So activity is essentially the total amount of goods and services that we consume. So in a domestic context, we might be talking about lowering thermostats. We heard an example of this from Marilyn's talk earlier. Food, we're talking about eating less meat. Travel, talking about traveling less. And so you can see some of the activity related options that I've highlighted. And I think often when we talk about behavioral change, we tend to think about these activity related measures where we're doing less of something. It relates to the concept of sufficiency that we've heard various authors talk about earlier. But it's important that from a modeling perspective, we're also interested in what we call structural shifts. So this is where we change the way in which we carry out a particular activity. So we use a different form of transport, for example, and you can see those examples where I put the S alongside these consumption options. And then finally, the final part of the decomposition is intensity. And this is where we can do things more efficiently. So using less energy or resources to carry out an activity. So for example, we can use heat pumps rather than gas boilers to heat our homes. And that has a big improvement in efficiency. So when you take activity, structure, and intensity together, when you combine them, you generate energy demand. And so by reverse, you can look at energy demand and break it down into these three elements. And this is what's commonly done in modeling. So here's an example. This was a study I was involved with called the Global Low Energy Demand Scenario. We developed a very rich narrative or storyline about change between now and 2050. It was a storyline which very much emphasized digitalization, decentralization, rapid innovation, the sorts of things we're familiar with when thinking through net zero challenges. So we took this storyline and we mapped that storyline into changes in activity, structure, and intensity. So very importantly, our global scenario was aiming to raise living standards in the global south. And so we actually saw that activity levels went up pretty much worldwide rather than down as you hear about in these sufficiency type scenarios. But we had very dramatic changes in the structure of how energy services are provided and also dramatic reductions in energy intensity of those services. We could then take those narrative assumptions and translate them into quantitative assumptions using literature and some demand sector models. So if you look on the left, for example, you see our assumptions for thermal comfort. So the blue bar shows that the activity, heating and cooling, went up from 2020 to 2050, but the intensity, the red bar, went dramatically down. And the combined result was the green bar, which is the change in energy consumption for thermal comfort. And you can see similar patterns on the other two graphs. In other words, we calculated energy demand from here to 2050 using this activity, structure, intensity decomposition matched to the kinds of empirical evidence that I showed you on the previous slide. And we were then able to use that to run a global systems model to look at the energy supply and the emissions from that energy supply. And this was actually a scenario which reached the Paris Agreement ambition of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. So the final thing to say is that as well as trying to model or capture behavioral changes, the ways we might do things differently, you can also try and model fundamental behavioral processes and dynamics. So here's an example, another study I was involved with looking at the uptake or diffusion of electric vehicles. So a critical question for net zero type models. Now, we know very well that the uptake of electric vehicles will depend on their cost, government grants, on the availability of recharging infrastructure and so on. But we also know from the technology diffusion literature that the way innovations spread is also fundamentally social. So we know that people have different risk preferences. Some people are very averse to trying new things out, and some people will jump in first. So these innovators and early adopters will try things out and then communicate their experiences to others through their social networks. And this drives diffusion. We know this very well from the empirical literature, but we don't represent this process in models. So we tried to do this by looking at empirical literature. We reviewed about 23 studies that quantified the effect of social influence on vehicle choice. Each one of these horizontal lines represents the uncertainty range from one study. We could then do something called a meta-analysis where you look for the robust effect across all these studies. And we could also explain that as a function of different regions around the world. And this gave us then a basis for implementing what we called social learning in a global integrated assessment model, in this case, one called IMAGE. And we could therefore look at the effect of technological learning, that is electric vehicles getting cheaper over time. That's the graph on the left. And we could compare that when we added in this effect of social learning, that is people becoming less risk averse towards trying electric vehicles over time. And you can see that the graph on the right shows uptake rates by the end of the century for electric vehicles that are significantly higher as a result of explicitly and endogenously modeling this behavioral phenomenon. So just to kind of, just to wrap up, this is the 2x2 set of options you have for trying to model behavior and behavior change in the sorts of models that I've been talking about, these global models. And Baz, as I mentioned, who's going to talk after me, will give you some other nice examples. And so to summarize, I think social and behavioral change is critical for net zero. I think we absolutely have to try and factor it into our quantitative analysis as best we can, either through scenario narratives, which we translate into model assumptions, or by trying to actually explicitly capture behavior change through improvements and extensions to our model. And just to leave you with this last thought, that often when talking about modeling behavior, you kind of get the response, well, you know, it's very uncertain and we don't have enough empirical evidence. Well, the future is undoubtedly uncertain, and it's as uncertain as it is for technological change as it is for behavioral change. This graph is a nice example where the red line shows the way we have included the cost of batteries and by extension electric vehicles in our models. And the black dots show that we have consistently got it wrong. We've consistently overestimated the cost of batteries. Very, very similar story to solar PV and other renewables. So the future is uncertain, but that applies equally to technological change as it does to behavioral change. And so that's not reason enough to not try and do better at modeling behavior. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you very much. I have one quick question for you. You mentioned the social learning factor. So you assume some stimulus to change the function form of the people consumer behavior from laggards to early adopters or innovator. Is that right?
We don't assume some change to the functional form of consumer preferences. We recognize that consumer preferences will be affected by social influence. That is, the information that they receive from adopters through their social networks. And we're just trying to explicitly capture that effect in our modeling analysis. So if you just assume, as models often do, that we will choose an electric vehicle because it is cost competitive with a regular vehicle, you're missing part of the behavioral story as to why people adopt electric vehicles. So that's what we were trying to do in that particular study.
So it means cognitive judgment of the discount rate is much lower than that before.
Well, so if you use your discount rate as a single quantitative measure of risk aversion, then you could simulate the effect of social influence by reducing the discount rate. But we didn't do it that way. We actually endogenized a specific mechanism relating to social influence in the model itself, alongside, if you like, pure rates of risk aversion from a discount rate.
Okay, kind of a hard rate. Thank you very much. So I'd like to move the next presenter, the final one. So next one is the Bas van Rieven. He's the research group leader, Sustainable Service Systems of EASA, Austria. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Atsushi. Can you see my my presentation all right and hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes, and thanks thanks to Charlie, and thanks for the organizers actually for scheduling us in a row, because this worked out very nicely. We work partly in the same research groups and on the same projects. So we can very much here continue with some of the examples that Charlie has mentioned in his talk already. And I've seen during his talk, I concluded that some of them are set up nicely, and for others, actually, things might be a little harder to follow for because I have some work here that predates what Charlie just showed. But I want to mostly focus on 3 examples on this same 2x2 that Charlie showed on how we can introduce behavioral change into models, right? Either as exogenous or endogenous modeling, or implicit or explicit. And so I want to focus on 2 examples that are in the upper right corner of this space. One, a very recent project on COVID recovery scenarios that is currently under review. Then some of the transport behavioral work actually that predates the example that Charlie just spoke about. And then I want to give a quick example about the iPads model, which as a way to implement this in models as that might not involve necessarily completely reworking your model or increasing the heterogeneity a lot. But to start with the COVID work, so we built upon the example and the method of the low energy demand scenario that Charlie mentioned to develop narratives about how we can recover from the COVID crisis. And we focused there both on changes in activity and activity levels, and on changes in the structure of what the activities may look like. Changes in intensity, if we look at this activity structure intensity framework, change in intensity or incredible efficiency improvements we deemed on the time scale up to about 2025 that we look at for these recovery scenarios, we deemed them not incredibly important on that short time scale. But if we look at this for activity, so we developed here 4 different narratives based on an axis where the recovery is either driven by policy or by social bottom-up changes that you see, axis that you see here from top to bottom. And it's axis from left to right here, where there is a return to a pre-COVID normal, where people want to return back to the world as they knew it, or a transition to a new normal after this crisis. And then the scenario that you see, the restore scenario in the bottom left, is this policy-driven restore scenario to a pre-COVID world, which is basically, you know, a brown recovery as quick as we can. But on the right, you see a green variant of that, a green push scenario, where there is a policy-driven scenario to actually go to a new energy demand situation, a new societal situation after the COVID crisis. And then on top, you see these, you know, similar scenarios. On the left, a self-reliant scenario, a strong social-driven recovery. And so not so much policy-oriented, but people driving their preferences in a return to a pre-COVID normal. And on the right, a scenario that has so social learning from this, from the COVID crisis. Right, and what you then see here in the narrative is, you know, going back to normal in the bottom right, going to large reductions and a very green future on the bottom right, and then on the top two scenarios, we see either much more transport and car driving on the left, and more teleworking and less commuting on the right. We then also translated, so this is about the activity levels. We also translated that to structural change, and I focus here actually on the structural changes in the transport sector, which is the top row in these three graphs. So in the restore scenario, you see no structural changes, but in the self-reliance scenario, you see this incredible growth in car use and reductions in public transport and in joint or common use of vehicles. Whereas on the right, this policy-driven, especially the green push scenario, you see this reduction in flying and an increase of rail and public transport. Now, if we look then at the consequences of these behavioral changes when coming out of the COVID crisis over the next 15 years, you see that on energy use here on the left, the quantifications that we came up with are the strongest for transport. You see here the red line for the self-reliance, highest car use recovery, and the green line for this green push, the most policy-driven green recovery, where in terms of energy use, you can see a distinct pattern between the three scenarios, but it's also not fundamentally different from trends that we have seen in the past. And that translates also into CO2 emissions. If we look here compared to what we were expecting pre-COVID, the black line, now you see the red, the orange, the blue, and the green lines for these COVID recovery scenarios. They are all a little bit lower, but without any additional push on climate change, on climate policies. COVID itself, and even if you have a very green recovery without additional climate policies, it will not push you towards a 1.5 or 2 degree scenario. For those, you really need additional climate policy. However, the difference between the two extreme types of recovery scenarios, in this case, this self-reliance and this versus the green push scenario, makes a big difference if you want to reach a 1.5 degree future. If we look here, the biggest pie on the top right corner of this pie diagram is the cost of the price of carbon that you need in order to reach this 1.5 degrees. And you see that if we have this very brown recovery, we have an increase in the carbon cost in order to reach 1.5 degrees. But if we have a green push recovery and we change our behavior in order towards the greenest behavior that we can imagine coming out of this crisis, it will reduce the overall effort that we need in order to go to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. And the same for energy investments, for electricity generation. It has all these other co-benefits, but it's not going to do the full transition for us. So far about the first example. Now I want to move on to a second example of this modeling that's also in the upper right corner of the 2x2, which is the disaggregation of transport modeling in the message model that we run at IASA. And this is working with Charlie has been involved as well at the time. And this actually predates the social learning study that he referred to. Because this is about splitting up initially just the consumers and the buyers of light duty vehicles into early adopters, early majorities, and late majority groups, and in their driving cycle. So whether they're frequent drivers, average drivers, or modest drivers, and where they live, whether they're in urban, suburban, or in rural areas. And with all these, so going from a single consumer in a model for each region, you go to 27 consumers for light duty vehicles in a model. And all of them have their own transport behavior, their own and their own preferences towards new technologies. And what they did very nicely in this study is to set up what is the impact of just increasing the heterogeneity in the model without changing the behavior, versus what is the impact of also of just changing the behavior of the consumers by having these different adoption groups, and then bring that what the impact is of bringing that together. So that's what you see here in this graph. On the top figure, we see basically the single consumer. No, it's a very homogeneous consumer, and it has no behavioral change the way it used to be before. You see this transition, and then you say if you just increase the heterogeneity by having multiple groups and accounting for their life cycle change, but you don't for the driving cycles, but you don't change the behavioral parameters, you get actually results in the middle left graph that are very comparable to the top graph, where the heterogeneity itself doesn't change your results that much. Then actually the middle graph on the right, but that includes the behavior and not the heterogeneity, but just taking account that you have actually people with different driving cycles, right? To the fact that you can do that at to the fact you can take that into account in an aggregate group. And there you see that actually this pattern emerges where you have a different transition going to different types of vehicles. And then if you bring them both together at the bottom of this graph, there you see that the behavioral component clearly dominates the results of bringing this together. So just bringing in heterogeneity will not help you. You also need to really parameterize that heterogeneity in your models in order to actually come up with different projections that account for the behavior. And this is the part where it's clear that this predates the study that Charlie referred to, because in this study they found that if you include the behavior, actually you have less mitigation potential. So the solid line is what happens without behavior. The dotted line is the mitigation potential with behavior, and the potential for reducing CO2 emissions was lower under the behavioral scenario. But this is a case where there is no behavioral change in behavioral learning. So this is sort of static. And later this was followed up by this behavioral social learning. And then you see what Charlie just showed, that you have actually a higher potential for mitigation if there is social learning going on. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the third example and move on to mention one study actually that we are just developing, funded by the Japanese Ministry of Energy and organized by RITE, the Japanese Research Institute for Innovation Technology, and IASA, where we explicitly look into we are setting up a consortium that looks into demand changes that are induced by technological social innovations. And the goal of this project is to improve the understanding of energy services and demand, and to increase the capacity to model behavioral change. And especially because that's what we learned from different IPCC assessments now in the past, and also the current ongoing one, there is a really lack of scenarios that look into behavioral change and low energy demands. And therefore, an explicit goal of this study is to really develop new demand side transformation scenarios, like the low energy demand scenarios, but at the city, at the country, at the continent, sectoral, global levels, the diversity of these scenarios, so that we can have a better understanding of behavioral change and what the potential of behavioral change is in bringing us towards a net zero society by the middle of the century. With that, I want to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for both. So our takeaway is summarized in the last slide in the edits project. So is there anything to add?
Yeah. Yes, I can hear you, yes.
Yeah.
Now, yeah, the takeaway is that the research community also noticed that there is a complete that demand side has been neglected for too long in behavioral change, and as a result we don't really understand it very well yet, and that is why we are setting up this edits project to really increase the knowledge base that we have about the potential of behavioral change.
Okay, thank you very much. So this session is very interesting, focusing on the data and also the methodology. So, but we need the data first. So, but there's a lot of challenges in the temporal resolution and also geographical resolution, and also the type of the energy consumptions and the equipment. Maybe we had a lot of challenge to gathering the data and also both in the methodology and data. So that's a short summary of the session, and I'd like to pass the moderator role to the Bate for conclusion.
Okay, thank you, Atsushi. And I have now 3 minutes to make some very short concluding remarks. First and foremost, the US is back in the Paris Agreement and in global cooperation to combat climate change. This matters very much in order to reach net zero emission by 2050, together with all the actors such as corporations, communities, individuals that have been active during the previous years. Well, I have 5 points. The first is that National R&D Funding Agency prioritize R&D that not only focuses on technology development, but increasingly integrates human and behavioral aspect in addressing the climate and energy challenge. Social sciences have much to offer. And we have seen different examples of that today. The Swiss program on social science and also the Research Council of Norway and its support to the large research center include are such examples. Secondly, it's all about inclusive processes, overcoming obstacles and barriers, and framing. So public engagement in political terms matters, such as early consultation. Policymakers can learn from citizens when designing and implementing policies. So make policy with the public. Public engagement in economic terms, such as ownership, matters. And here we do not speak about our pension funds. That's another big discussion, but we speak about community shareholders and co-ownership. How can we make you love, can we make ourselves love the wind turbines just by a share in your local wind farm? That matters. Equally important is the opportunity to teach the general public in a non-partisan way, to provide the facts, the arguments, and actions also to accelerate the clean energy transition. Point 3, people matters, and factors such as age, gender, income, and education influence the attitude and behavior. Energy efficiency, but also the last example on transport and the choice of vehicles are important areas that are being researched more and more. So it's not just about nudging behavior towards better individual choices, but as the Swiss examples show, rather to transform the everyday life that in order to change our behavior. People and citizens are indeed not a uniform group, but highly heterogeneous. And in order to improve energy efficiency or choose a better car, we have to observe the different patterns of behavior. And for valid and reliable decision support tools and modeling are needed to make the necessary wise, right decision to pave the way for net zero emissions by 2050. So it's important to get the data right. Setsuren told us how to actually get very detailed data on consumption, because measuring preferences is definitely not a straightforward task. They are dynamic, complex, and really very challenging. So as Charlie said, social and behavioral change can and should be captured in net zero emission scenarios, either translated into modeling assumption or internalized as parameters and relationships within models. International collaboration in modeling takes place and has taken place in many years in the context of IASA, in the context of the IEA subgroup, and in many other communities. This is very important in order to provide these energy system modeling and forecast with high quality data and results. And the fifth thing is, will the COVID-19 impact the energy, the clean energy transmission? Will we work more from home? Will we travel less? I think one very important lesson is that we have seen radical changes in behavior. So the question is, can that be mobilized in order to combat climate change? Can we feel the same urgency as we have felt during the COVID-19 pandemic? And also the huge investment programs now underway in many countries in order to stimulate the economy. Will that be made in a fair, inclusive, and also a combination of smart, socially driven policies and participative green push policies? Can we get this new normal in order to reach a net zero emission by 2050? So these were my concluding remarks. I want, on behalf of the organizers, thank the speakers, the moderators, and all of you from around the world. Thank you so much for joining our webinar, and goodbye from Copenhagen.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.